Thank you. So now finally we return to Istanbul with Çiğdem Kafescioğlu, who will talk to us about the place we all want to hear about, the Topkapı Palace.
Hopefully.
Medieval connections and new configurations in space and imagery.
Thank you, Paul, and my thanks also, of course, to the organizers. I'll go back into walls, unfortunately, but out again in a while, and I'll try not to try your patience as much as I can as the last speaker of the day. A passage in the early 16th century chronicle of the historian Neşri perhaps best captures the multiplicity of palatial spaces alongside the multiplicity of palatial notions, all centered on the urban citadel in various forms and conceptual links, in Mehmed II's Istanbul in the years that followed the Ottoman takeover of Constantinople. Commenting on the works, the Asar of the Ottoman ruler, he writes, he built a tower and used it as a treasury. He built a citadel-like enclosure around the old palace. He resided there, not favoring it. He built another citadel, built lofty palaces in it, and rendered it the seat of his throne. Kule yapıp, hazine idüp, eski sarayı yapıp, kaleveş bir harem çevirdi, anda tavattun itti, sonra anı beğenmeyip bir kale daha yaptırıp, harem idüp, içinde âli saraylar yapıp anı tahtgah edindi. The kule, or tower here, is the citadel, the yedi kule, or the seven towers at the Golden Gate. The kaleveş, or citadel-like wall, was built to protect what was already in Neşri's time known as the Old Palace, the vast enclosure encompassing part of the Forum Theodosius and the slopes to its north. And finally, the chosen residence of the monarch, the Kala, or citadel adorned with lofty palaces, the new palace, or Topkapı, at the tip of the Constantinopolitan peninsula. Neşri's terminology, as well as his portrayal of a speedy but shifting series of constructions, captures something of the transitional nature of initial palatial undertakings of the Ottomans during their early years in Constantinople, and the urban and palatial concepts that informed these choices. Here I'd like to explore two transitional phases that bear on spatial and visual practices engendered by the Citadel Palace at different historical conjunctures. The first having to do with multiple Ottoman interpretations of the Citadel paradigm through their initial interventions to the Constantinopolitan cityscape, all directed at significant sites of the Byzantine city, noted by Neşri in the passage that I just quoted. The second, what I would like to suggest, was a moment of changing uses and perceptions of the fortified palace at the turn of the 17th century. Both moments correspond to a transformative phase in the history of the Ottoman polity. The first, with the larger project of state and city building, involving the major political and cultural reorientation and concomitant processes of the restructuring of the administrative apparatus, and a city building project involving massive enterprises of deportations, and beyond palaces, ambitious representational and infrastructural projects that I will not be mentioning here. Configurations of Ottoman palaces and changes in uses that shortly followed their construction highlight a moment when late medieval and emerging early modern forms and symbols of rulership, rooted in diverse cultural spheres, were juxtaposed in the space of the capital. Little is known of the layout of Mehmed II's first palace, located according to Kritovulos at the finest and best location in the city, except that it housed numerous kiosks, gardens, and hunting preserves, the monumental column of Theodosius, And as Ayda Eral has drawn attention to, a massive multi-story structure, probably a multifunctional palace tower modeled after the late medieval palatial towers in Ottoman lands, in turn models on Byzantine, Balkan, and Aegean structures of comparable use. I'll return to that issue shortly. Surrounded by walls that isolated it from the city in whose midst it was located, this was conceived as a calais, a palace citadel, an enclosure within a military stronghold, widespread, particularly from the 11th and 12th centuries onwards in the larger Islamic world. Neshri's term kalevesh, citadel-like rather than kale, a fort or citadel, underlines that the palatial enclosure was less than military, not only in its functions, but also in its appearance. It may be noteworthy that what best captures its citadel aspect is the urban district to which it was attached, and to which, in part at least, it owes its location. This is the Tahta Kale, or Taht al-Kal'a in its proper rendering, area, meaning under the citadel. The term already in use during the first decades of the Ottoman rule to denote the commercial center on the Golden Horn, inherited from the Byzantine city, of course. The term denoted the commercial district through its spatial relationship to the citadel palace in other Middle Eastern cities, pointing to an urban model that informed the choice of site for the old palace. A Place de Seraglio, or a palace square, referred to in a French narrative of Mehmed II's funeral procession in 1481, underlines the palace's relationship to another urban locus, the remaining section of the Theodosian Forum on which it was located. What remained of the forum constituted a forecourt to the palace, and the gallery mentioned in the French text and represented in an early 16th century chronicle in the context of Bayezid II's funeral was possibly the belvedere of a gate complex modeled after ceremonial palace gatehouses that were part of Islamic as well as Roman and Byzantine palatial traditions. The vast enclosure beyond it would soon be abandoned to the imperial harem. Its expansive gardens and game preserves were a reason for courtly visits to it. The Yedi Kule, or Seven Towers, which integrated what had once been the Byzantine city's ceremonial gate into its pentagonal star-shaped enclosure, was a military counterpart to this first palace at the center of the city. The lurking possibility of a crusade and the earlier Byzantine use of this exact site, flanking the inner side of the gate as a military stronghold, a little town according to Dukas and well known to Ottomans, must have figured in the decision to construct a citadel here as a refuge and point of defense in time of conflict. A contemporary Italian connection outside the late Byzantine one figured into its design and construction. The ground plan, based on a six-pointed star overlapping the Golden Gate, reveals an unmistakable relationship to architectural theories developed in the same decades by Leon Battista Alberti and Filarete. Here, the city plan of Filarete for Sforzinda, his design for the Count of Sforza. I will not go into any detail of the layout or into the debate on where this inspiration may have been rooted in. Its shifting uses and denominations, on the other hand, may be telling in the contemporary context. While embodying all attributes of an urban citadel, with military, residential, storage, and treasury functions, with access to both within and outside the city, the seven-towered enclosure was never called a kale, as a citadel in the Ottoman Islamic tradition would have been, but was referred to as kule, tower, in contemporary and later Ottoman sources. I missed a slide. As I already noted, to Neşri, it was a treasury tower, conceptually, if not architecturally, firmly rooted in earlier Ottoman practice. Two Italians at the Ottoman court foregrounded its palatial aspect. Mainavino called it the third palace of the Grand Turk. Angelo narrated the transfer of treasury from the Topkapı to the citadel and described the royal quarters furnished for the use of the Sultan. If any rooms within the enclosures, Byzantine or Ottoman towers, were furnished as royal quarters, however, this still seems far removed from fortified palaces with more expansive residential and ceremonial functions in contemporary and earlier Byzantine and Balkan worlds. Conceived as military stronghold, palace, treasury, and Ottoman landmark on site of Byzantine significance, Yedikule soon changed functions. Apart from remaining a storage space of ammunitions and staples, from the 16th century onward particularly, there is ample evidence that the citadel was a prison for captives of the highest order. Famously, it was the site of the first regicide in Ottoman history in the early 17th century. Its palatial prison aspect perhaps recalls the Castel Sant'Angelo of Rome, among whose residents was the Ottoman Prince Cem in the final years of the 15th century. I turn briefly to the third chosen residence of Mehmed II, the new palace occupying the site of the ancient Byzantine Acropolis near the city's main religious monument, the Hagia Sophia, and its main urban square, the Hippodrome. The Topkapı has been studied exhaustively. In Gülru Necipoğlu's work, we have an invaluable key to understanding its architecture and its cultural meanings through the later 16th century. Here I will only underline two features of its architecture in the early years of its foundation to continue on my theme of shifts in notions and uses of palatial spaces during this period. The 15th century building was completed in phases. The initial core, consisting of two consecutive courtyards housing administrative and service quarters and ceremonial spaces in the first, the private quarters of the Sultan and the royal pages in the second, alongside the private audience hall, began shortly following Mehmed's announcement of a large-scale urban project in 1458. The second building phase, completed 2 decades later, endowed the palace with its outer wall, incorporating a stretch of the Byzantine sea walls. Both the initial construction of 2 courtyards and the enlargement that followed shortly were conceived as citadel palaces, marked with several towers of various functions and significance, both in their enclosures and within. Here we have the first section in both images, interestingly sort of merged into one, marked by towers, particularly in Matrakçı, and then the impregnable fort surrounding the entity. The outer enclosure wall, the Kalata Sultaniya or the Kale-i Cedid, the royal fort or the new fort or citadel, created a highly isolated enclosure surrounded by a fortress wall with little defensive function, marked with towers and a monumental portal featuring a royal pavilion, which Susan just mentioned. Gülru Necipoğlu has discussed in depth the notions of imperial seclusion underlining the divine and absolute authority of the Sultan that were set in stone through the spatial configuration of the palace, which tightly regulated and hierarchized physical and visual access to its parts and ultimately to the person of the ruler. She has also explored in depth the ocular politics of the site, predicated on the symbolically represented gaze of the invisible Sultan. embodied by various architectural elements that entered a set of visual relationships with the city. The numerous Belvedere towers, the Treasury Tower of the Second Court, the arched loggia of the private treasury, the royal loggia, visible here atop the palace gatehouse. Like the new mosque complex founded by the Sultan in the same years, the new palace was a complete newcomer to the Ottoman world. It replaced the loose spatial organization of early Ottoman palaces, which were dotted with numerous pavilions and temporary structures and marked with a multifunctional royal tower, by a tightly organized, if not symmetrically or axially conceived space where particular functions were distributed to a variety of newly designed structures. The multi-domed porticoed privy chamber, for which no precedent remains in former Ottoman palaces, suggests a transition from similarly planned urban structures, such as multi-domed mosques or market halls, into the private realm of the palace. An unresolved question regarding its construction history may be worth reviewing here. A massive square foundation and basement underneath the privy chamber, it was suggested by Ekrem Hakkı Ayverdi, was laid out for the construction of a tower in the manner of the royal tower of the Edirne Palace, a reconstruction of a later phase of it here, the Cihannüma Kasrı, completed by Mehmet II in 1452, just a year before the fall of Constantinople. Ayverdi suggested that underneath the privy chamber was the foundation of a multi-storied tower abandoned at Mehmet's death, and draw attention to the otherwise unnecessarily bulky basement walls of the building. In a 1996 article, Ayda Arel took Ayverdi's suggestion into consideration, demonstrating the centrality of multifunctional towers serving as treasury, residence, belvedere, and private audience hall in Ottoman palaces of the early 15th century. Arel located the emergence of such structures, possibly to the rule of Murat II, and traced the continued use of towers in palaces of the Ottoman dynasty and elite into the 16th century. After Rıfat Osman and his work on Edirne, she also drew attention to the multiple denominations of the Edirne Tower. Among them, Kasr-ı Padişahi, Royal Palace, Taht-ı Hümayun Kasrı, Palace of the Royal Throne, Cihannüma Kasrı, Belvedere Palace, Has Oda, Privy Chamber, and Has Oda Köşkü, Privy Chamber Kiosk. The final two overlapping with the denomination of the Topkapı Privy Chamber as Has Oda, the other terms underlining its ceremonial function as throne hall and its visual function as Belvedere. If indeed a tower was begun to be built in Topkapı at the present site of the Privy Chamber, and the preference for a multi-domed structure surrounded by porticos prevailed, we then have a building which embodies in itself the abandonment of a medieval sensibility for an emerging new aesthetic and symbolism. Such alteration in plans, which does not necessarily have to be due to the passage of Mehmet II, might also explain the novel conception of the treasury and bath complex across from the privy chamber and the location of the private audience hall immediately behind the third gate. Audience hall, residence, and treasury within the palatial tower were now disconnected, the latter attached to a royal bathhouse, treasury tower cum belvedere replaced by treasury with a view commanding Italian-style loggia. The architectural aesthetic of porticoed transitional spaces replaced one that highlighted the royal tower. The 15th century palace did, of course, house one such tower, the Tower of the Outer Treasury, the Tower of Justice of later centuries, its presence evinces both the continued import of the notion and the breaking away from such massive multifunctional edifices as in the Edirne Tower. Inserted into a rapidly changing political and urban landscape, loose there again, but I'm not talking on it, the first two citadel palaces soon changed functions. The Topkapı, as Ottoman locus of rule, preserved its initial conceptualization to an important degree through the following centuries, with additions, alterations, expansions in response to transitions in court, city, and empire. In what follows, I would like to question such a juncture of change, in part in the fabric of the palace complex, but also in its uses and perceptions at the decades around the turn of the 17th century. Ottoman historians working in various areas have focused a significant amount of attention and work over the last decades in order to elucidate the political, cultural, economic dynamics of the series of transformations that marked the Ottoman world from the later decades of the 16th century onwards into the 17th and 18th. While various interpretations of the nature of change in Ottoman politics, culture, and society have been offered, a common ground of agreement may be that from the final decades of the 16th century onwards, elites and urban populations had to respond to a series of structural transformations in the political and economic spheres, amounting to a sea change of attitudes in cultural history, in Cemal Kafadar's words. This had significant implication for city and court, altering elite agendas of self-representation within the urban sphere, bringing formerly less conspicuous groups into the stage of urban action and representation, hence significant consequences for the locus or loci of rule, the farther end of which Tülay Artan provided important insights into during her lecture. My question has to do with the earlier end of that process. Through much of the 16th century, the sole extensions of the palace on the Marmara and Golden Horn shores were small pavilions, notably built by Bayezid II and the marble kiosk of Selim I, approximately here. A single-story structure of exquisite materials. As Gülür Necipoğlu has noted, the shore pavilions were primarily spaces of private retreat and from early on points of contact with the city for the secluded sultan. Here an image of the marble pavilion. Two projects funded by the powerful Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha in the early 1590s, the Injeel Köşk, the Pearl Pavilion facing the Marmara, right here, and the Shore Pavilion facing the Galata and Tophane shores, introduced a new scale and eventually new functions to the palace's seaside pavilions. With later additions of comparable scales, including the Basketmaker's Pavilion, some decades later, the royal fort was now punctured by edifices built atop and abutting its walls, underlining a departure from an earlier palatial paradigm. While dwarfed by the sea walls, the new scales providing expanding spaces to former and emerging uses beyond the imperial fort might be noteworthy. The Injeel Köşk, Pearl Pavilion, whose novelty and uniqueness were celebrated by the contemporary Selanik'i, stood on an expanded stone platform that embraced a Byzantine tower and boasted one of the largest domed spaces in the Topkapı, was used as a banqueting hall and private retreat, also a spot where ships arriving at the port might salute the Sultan. Sinan Pasha's second addition to the shore was the rebuilding of the early 16th century Yalı Köşkü or Shore Pavilion, completed just 2 years after the Pearl Pavilion. He undertook this construction only a decade after the building had been extensively renovated. Built on a wharf jutting out to the sea, this had been from early on a reviewing stand for departures and arrivals of the Ottoman Navy. A cross-shaped domed hall surrounded by an arcade of some 3 meters in width, the new Yalı Köşkü presented a broad facade to the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, its remarkably spacious openness to the sea captured by its images. It may be misleading, of course, to regard its later 18th century images with densely packed participants surrounding the Sultan during a ceremonial event, to read its use at the turn of the 17th century. While the ceremonial configuration was most likely not the same, the modality of its use may not have been radically different, as period narratives attest to. Was the shore pavilion a new type of palatial space beyond the citadel walls that emerged into the seascape of Istanbul to lend the Sultan a new kind of visibility, however brief the stretches of time, that was not afforded by the Topkapı's various tower pavilions? The question is surely inspired by things rather removed in time and space and concept, perhaps hindsight from later, particularly 18th century shore palaces stretching along the Bosphorus, as discussed by Tülay Artan in the opening lecture, may lead to such a question, as do the Isfahani spaces that we have just looked at. But the novelty of the Yalı Köşkü and its likes may also be considered within the specific context of the late 15 and early 1600s in light of other Ottoman interventions to the environs of the palace. The land walls of the Topkapı and the gate pavilion and towers continued to mark and symbolically charge the boundary between court and city, but the decades around the turn of the 17th century witnessed unprecedented ceremonial and architectural presence of the court in areas that lay immediately beyond those walls. Events such as the 1582 celebrations that kept the court at the city, seeing and being seen, for nearly 2 months may be mentioned, alongside 3 royal mausolea flanking the Hagia Sophia. Their construction completed in 1577, 1600, and 1609. The last one overlapping with the foundation of the Sultan Ahmet complex that reconfigured the hippodrome's boundaries, brought another royal mausolea to the area eventually, whose mosque was aligned with the royal pavilion of the palace. May be recounted. The court's growing visibility in the city center was inscribed into book painting of the Ottoman court, whose various connections to this period of transformation we have a much better understanding of thanks to recent works of Serpil Bağcı, Emine Fetvacı, and Tülün Değirmenci. In contrast to earlier images that situated the Sultan when in the capital city always within palaces and palatial gardens, monarchs of the past and the present, Süleyman the lawgiver here, and Mehmet III, were now, to the right, were now portrayed in the central spaces of the city. The edges of the imperial fort entered the thematic range of Ottoman painters in images of the Sultan watching urban events or the sea near or beyond, above the walls of the fort. It is then no coincidence that painters at the Ottoman court introduced a further novel theme to the royal iconography of illustrated manuscript, with images that centered on the passage from the palace into the space of the capital city through the palace gate with its royal pavilion. The moment of passage through that boundary of the Grand Vizier here, in one case the powerful, now deceased Queen Mother, and the monarch leaving the palace grounds, in a painting by Ahmet Nakshi. This perceptive observer of this climate of change perhaps captured the shift in the image of the monarch, portraying him at the symbolically charged boundary between court and city. Beyond the gate and its pavilion, Nakshi foregrounded the corporeal image of the ruler stepping or leading his horse out into the city to share the same urban space with the ruled. The pictorial representation of that liminal moment may be read as one of the signs, multiplying through these years, of the articulation of a new public image of the Ottoman monarch beyond the fortified world of the Topkapı, which would coexist with and complicate an earlier royal image constructed with and through that fort. Thank you.
Thank you, Çiğdem, for this survey of how the Citadel Palace became adapted to the big city. Do we have any questions? Everyone's satisfied. So, thank you again. Thank everybody again in this session. And 15 minutes break before we conclude.